Hello everyone, welcome to Indian Economy by Aman Soni. In this new series called Eco Priority, we would discuss the important concepts for the upcoming prelims examination. Now, let's discuss the topic debt financing versus monetization of deficit. Generally, whenever there is a fiscal deficit, what is fiscal deficit? It is the difference between government's revenue and expenditure. So, in order to meet the excess amount, the government would have certain options. What can the government do in order to increase the revenue? It can increase the tax revenue so that it can get more revenue for financing the deficit. But increasing the tax revenue is not always possible because when the economy is already in slowdown, at that time increasing taxes would suck out more money supply from the economy, and the business interest would get affected, the business sentiments would get affected, and when the overall economy is performing very bad, even the increase in tax rate doesn't lead the government to have more revenue because the overall economy is performing bad. So that is not an option when the economy is performing badly. And the other options are borrowing and printing money. So here comes the option of debt financing. What is debt financing? When the government borrows from the public, say from the domestic consumers, from the domestic public, or from the external sources, say from the institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, or from the external markets, that is debt financing. Because in order to finance the deficit in the budget, in order to deficit the budget, you are giving out debt. You are financing your deficit through the debt. That is why the term debt financing. And the related term is direct monetization of deficit, where the government would ask the RBI to print more money and the government would issue bonds to the RBI. Now let's look at the difference between both these terms because they are slightly confusing. As we have discussed, what is debt financing? In order to bridge the deficit, in order to do the deficit financing could be done in three ways, whether by increasing tax revenues or through debt financing or through direct monetization of deficit. We discussed how increasing tax revenue is not an option always. So the other two ways are debt financing and monetization of deficit. Under debt financing, the government would either borrow from the internal sources or the external sources. The government would borrow by issuing the dated government securities, that is the long-term bonds, and it would issue the treasury bills. It would take assistance from the external institutions, say the World Bank or the IMF, and the treasury bills are issued by the RBI on behalf of the government. There are certain problems with going for debt financing because when you borrow too much, what does it mean? Currently, you're paying the interest payments every year. So the interest payments would be, say, some 10% of the total borrowing that you would be paying. But when the maturity of the bond happens, that means in the future point of time, say after 10 years, after 15 years, after 25 years, when the maturity of the bond happens, it is the future generation, the future citizens who have to pay from their pocket at that point of time. So it affects the intergenerational equity because the current generation is borrowing debt and they are putting the impact of the debt on the heads of the future generation. So too much debt financing also affects the intergenerational equity. And too much borrowing by the government in the market would discourage the private players from borrowing, because when the government borrows too much, that means the amount of funds available in the market would reduce. So whatever is the limited funds, there will be too much demand for that. When there is too much demand for the limited funds, the cost of capital would be high. If the cost of capital is high, it will discourage the private players from investing into the economy, discourage them from borrowing and investing back into the economy. That's why it will lead to crowding out of the private companies. So too much borrowing by the government will crowd out the private companies. This is about debt financing. Remember, debt financing is nothing but your financing to cover your debt, that is your borrowing in simple words. And what is monetization of deficit? The other way, instead of directly borrowing, the government has RBI with it. So what the government can do under direct monetization, the government can ask the RBI to print new currency, and in return for printing the new currency, the government would give out bonds to the RBI, and the government would pay the interest on the bonds. And under indirect monetization, the government would ask the RBI to go for open market operations, wherein the RBI will purchase or sell bonds in the economy in the secondary market and borrow money. For example, if the government wants money, what would the RBI do? The RBI would sell market securities through the open market operations. It will sell securities in the market and borrow money, and this money will be lent by the RBI to the government. So this is indirect monetization. Under direct monetization, you are printing new currency and the government issues bonds to the RBI for that. But there is again problem with monetization of the deficit also. When you are directly printing new currency, that would mean the government will have more money at its disposal, so it would spend more. So when it spends more, it directly puts cash into the economy. The money supply in the economy will increase, and that will lead to increase in the inflation. So direct monetization would lead to inflation, and too much supply of rupee in the economy will lead to the depreciation of value of rupee. For example, when the printing of currency happens and the money supply in the economy increases, compared to the dollars, the supply of rupee will be high in the economy. So when there is demand supply mismatch, because the value of dollar, the number of dollars in the market is low compared to the supply of rupee, the value of dollar against the rupee will increase. That is, the value of rupee depreciates. Currently, we generally don't go for printing of the new currency unless it is a rare situation. We generally go for indirect monetization. That is, the RBI will go for open market operations to borrow for the government. That's about this topic. Thank you so much.